Hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's launch of New Poetries VIII. This is the book that we're launching again tonight. This is our fourth launch. There are 24 brilliant poets, we think, in this anthology, and we're really delighted that four of them are going to be reading for you tonight. Two of the poets are from near Manchester, and it brings home to me how much I do miss the prospect of having a home launch for Holly and for Christine Rosita Walker, because these are poets I know from the city, and I know how much their readers and their friends here would enjoy seeing them in person. Wouldn't we love to see everybody in person these days? But we're really delighted that we can run this event over Zoom. And one of the great upsides of Zoom is that other people from all over the place who will know our readers and who are interested in poetry can join us on these evenings. As you will know, and I know many of you will have been at launches or will be familiar with Zoom, but the page of the poems at the Carcanet launches appears on the screen in front of you with the author to one side, but you can switch that around as you see fit to focus on the reader rather than the text. The other thing that I'd like to ask you to do is to please use the chat function. There's a lovely sense of, at poetry readings, of the people around you responding to things, and we do want to try and use the chat function to let everybody know that there's a crowd here, and it would be great if you could just pop in the chat, tell us where you're watching us from tonight. If you're sitting down to eat your dinner in this time zone, do tell us, and we look forward to seeing that over the next hour or so. We're going to start off tonight with Christine Rosita Walker, then Holly Hopkins, then Tristram, Fane, Saunders, and we're going to finish with Isabelle Williams. And I'm going to begin by introducing Christine's work. Christine Rosita Walker studied poetry and fiction at Manchester. Christine's poems, when I met them in workshops, were and still are completely distinctive. She brings a whole range of voices and a sense of another time to bear on the moment that we find ourselves in. She writes in the anthology preface about how, as she wrote, the small streets of her home place, Negril, Jamaica, the sea, the river there, are always there when she starts thinking about new poems. She is, it seems to me, one of those poets who is bound to the place and a particular time in that place. A reporter from the recent past, which can so often feel most far away from us. She brings that time's concerns vividly and painfully to life in her poems. And as she does so, her poems, as you're about to hear, come home to us. Migration, race, pandemic, HIV in these poems, environmental changes, her places open out to many others in these poems. So welcome now to Christine Rosita Walker.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's really good to hear somebody else speaking about me. It does sound a lot like myself, which is good. And I want to also thank Michael for giving me this opportunity to see my work in print. So tonight I'm going to be reading 4 poems. The first one is Winston. And I wrote this poem years after coming back from my father's funeral in Jamaica. Winston. You know, it wasn't rude you asking to move to Manchester, where you pictured the streets ripe with gold. You sitting on Dada's bed, fear quivering up your lips, waiting to hear the words, he lived, you didn't. His dreadlocks spread out like a block cotton sheet, spoiled by the stillness of his wide eyes. Can you remember saying I should have burned his thin body down to the bones? You sigh a breath of relief when I said the police would get you. Miss Sylvia coming close, telling me, here is your father. I looked at you sitting on the rock, your voice like Dad's. Here is your father. It stayed with me a long time. Winston, I must tell you, England is hard. Nothing worth having is free. No grave mourners or coconut trees. No Nesberry, star apples, or sweet sop. No yellow fish tail boiling with Scotch bonnet in a Dutch pot. You would hate the beachless streets, curse at the biting east wind, and swear at the slow, lazy rain. You would despise daytime TV, bin your bangers and mash, and pour a pound of salt on the toad in the hole. Winston, I must tell you, it wasn't rude of you to ask. It's always tricky reading that one back. Well, the second poem I'm going to read is Howard's Oars, and this poem is inspired by my mother's uncle. Howard's Oars. He was ruled by the full grey moon, the fourth son of maroon and German blood. Eyes deep blue, his hands inured to pulling daily seines to canoes until noon. He was divided by a malignant star, the only child to be born of the lunar touch. Once a year, he would vanish into the coral wilderness of his spurious mind and his swelling scar. He would lay siege in the all-less sink kitchen, in his barracuda's den, where he scaled his nephew's flesh with his swordfish blade. Like a noxious eel drowned by a cursing fire, his mind was let back in. He would have no memory of the day before and would sit beneath his yellow door and tell the story of a giant fish with stings and wings and moonshine eyes, which stole his oars and watched him die. So the third poem I'm going to read is The Crab Catchers. And this sort of reminds me of my own childhood, the sort of activity that we would do once a year, which we were allowed to do as children. The crab catchers. Popping torchlight brought the children and their rippling shadows to the morass where the bush crabs rested at the mangrove's edge. Crabs up to their bellies in mud, seated by their doors, with giant claws pillowed on sludge, their dotted eyes watch shadows passing before the moon. Each child armed with crocus bags and bottles of light looked like fireflies caught in the thickets in the night, with mosquitoes playing jankunu and fifes. The crabs, seeing the darkness exploding with light, turned away from the moon. They scrambled on their stiletto legs and dashed down their watery holes. Stretching and reaching through the escapees' doors with optic hands, the children brought the crabs back to face the knots in the burlap bags. Now, tiptoeing on their neighbors' carapaces, they foam and watch the sky from the bottom of a drum, waiting for a cloud to stand still before the mongoose sun. The final poem is Mischief, and I wanted to write a poem where everything is imagined, and this is what happened during that process. Mischief. I'm not going to tell you who poisoned the old tamarind tree. I'm not ready to disclose who was swinging from the branch, or what happened before they landed. I'm not going to tell you about the empty fishing boat sinking. I'm not ready to tell you what happened to the shark that pulled it in. I'm not going to tell you who tied the plastic around the shark's head, or who started the fire under Granny's bed. I'm not ready to tell you who smoked the last cigarette, the tobacco, and the seaweed from the cabinet. I'm not going to tell you who stole the money from the letter, the mattress, and the saving can. I'm not going to tell you who drank the Aperol rum, then hid the bottle under the drum. I'm not ready to disclose who mudded the white blankets on the wire, drying. I'm not going to tell you who wore your favorite slipper or whose dog chewed up the leather strap. I'm not going to tell you who set fire to the cat's tail or who puts it out with a blanket from the trunk. I'm not ready to disclose who ate both Johnny cakes and the 4 chicken legs from Uncle Sam's dinner. I'm not going to tell you how I know all this. Don't ask me to squeal who done it. No, I can't tell you about the matchsticks, the toxin, or the rope on the old fruit tree. I can't tell you whose boat it was or where the shark ended up. I can't tell you about the rum, the weed, or who mixed in the mud. I'm not going to tell you where I saw your English money spending. It wasn't your dog that bites through your slippers, and I'm not going to tell you whose it was, because if I did, then this would be mischief. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Christine. That's such a cracking poem. So wonderful to hear those poems, and great as well to see the people responding to it in the chat as well. Michael set aside our next reader, Holly Hopkins' poems for me to look at not so long after I started working at Carcanet. I was immediately engaged by these quick, carefully observed, quizzical poems, which take such care about figuring out their scenes and their characters, seeming to test them line by line. It took me a while to figure out that the poems were by the Holly who I had met not long before at a reading by Isabelle Gallimore and Stephen Sexton at Blackwell's here in Manchester. And I can, now that I mention both of those poets, see something of Isabelle Gallimore's precise image making and her observational skills, and also some of Stephen's meditative narrative skill as well in what Holly does. She writes in her preface about how in the poems she is not just talking to us, but drafting a communication to myself. And there's a sense when we read, and when you will now hear her read those poems, that we are watching a scrutinizing intelligence sizing up and figuring out the world. A really pleasurable experience for the reader and the listener. So please welcome Holly Hopkins.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and to everyone at Carcanet for the work that went into creating this book. I'm going to kick off with a poem called Housekeeping. Housekeeping. While scrubbing saucepans, gloved hands sucked and sunk in steamy waters, I've not looked up and caught the blushing tail of an epiphany through the kitchen window, or glanced one floating in the burnished flank of a toaster. A child next door is practicing scales on an angry, block-nosed recorder. Small woman, sensible pebble dash. Can we not be honest with one another? Is it really just me who must shove all the mess in a cupboard for the whole afternoon to get nearly anywhere? Come, take my hand while the dam holds. The downstream path is in festival. I know a pub where we'll meet such characters. Now, I've promised you some characters, so I should share some. Most of you will be very, very familiar with the Canute legend, and that it's one that's completely swapped its meaning over time. The first Canute most of us come across is the more modern one, the man telling waves to stop rising because he's so deluded he thinks it's going to work. And then as we grow older, often we come across the older version, which is a legend about a virtuous man who is sick of being surrounded by toadies and is saying, look, even I, King Canute, am a mortal man and God controls everything. This next poem includes both of those two Canutes, and I've added a third Canute of my own. 3 King Canutes. The king, his gold retainers, a school of priests, the men who can't remove their helmets out of doors, and the plush unarmoured cross a mirror-surfaced beach. 1. Laugh. Laugh at the foolish fop-haired Rollo Squareface as he waves his sword, slashes water, cold stung, face infection hot with tears, a mug in ruined boots. 2. The second king has quietness, a loved teacher waiting for his class to own their error. Surf nuzzles at his ankles. This man's immovable except a roll of hair caught in the wind's chill currents, and his eyes resting in the eye of each advisor until the sycophant wilts. 3. This last Canute has brought a camera crew. His open suit and tie flap, the one concession his women swapping heels for ballet pumps. When water fills his shoes, it doesn't matter, he is rich, and there's blankets in the waiting SUV. He roars the waves will hold as water's licking up his trouser legs. He thinks he's in a story and the better story wins, that truth is just the story that the audience lets in. It doesn't matter if he's Canute or Canute. If we're in Norfolk or in Neverwhere, he's mic'd up, entertaining, and his wife and daughter's hair is sprayed as hard as bronze. The wind, the sea, cannot mar the shot. Now, I'm one of those people that is absolutely hopeless in strong heat, which means the traditional English summer suits me quite well, but we all know that summer is changing and that temperatures are rising. Here is a poem about that called The English Summer. Dun-coloured species, The English Summer. Dun-coloured endangered species of specialist interest, best found on grungy paths, behind gabardines, near shoes on school radiators, wet socks at work, a third creature, hood-hidden, brolly-blinded, shy. The invasive species, a fearsome firestorm of pale blue sky, a lethopathic leaf crisper, river fading grass bleacher, ice cream smiling skin killer, furs burning forest eater, agricide. See the burn blisters on the ridge of this ear. See water rationing. See heat edema. See dizziness. This next poem is also linked in my mind with the hazy, hot, heady days of summer. It's called The Death of a Fridge. Poured on skin, lighter fluid burns shallow. My hand in flames no worse than a plaster ripped off. We were more burnt by the sun. I can't even remember his name. He had a newspaper rolled in a torch burning up too quick and nowhere to drop it, so we slammed it in the fridge. The box sealed, a rubber trim sucked tight. We couldn't force it any more than we could pull apart a dinner plate. Not crack a dish, but hold the rims and pull it in two. Everything has its own way to break. The air was eaten. A dimple in the cool enamel, a crease, then, drawn from the inside, the whole white weight crumpled with thunks of deep-struck metal, as a girl, trapped by an earthquake, might smash keys on the pipe when she still thinks of rescue. This final poem is called How to Balance Law Books on Your Head, and it's an instructional poem on how to balance law books on your head. The problem isn't how. I absolutely know the answer is to go to a main street, some town I don't live, and find a stranger who hates me. And my clothes, and my voice, and who, while they would never dream of hurting me in person, suspects the world would be better with me dead. And persuade her that she wants to stand so close my greasy nose presses into hers and, recycling each other's soupy breaths, balance the books between us on our foreheads. My only problem is how to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Holly. It was a lovely reading. It falls to me to introduce the next two poets, which I do with enormous pleasure. The first is Tristram, Fane, Saunders. Tristram and I share, though separated by 5 decades, a publisher in the form of Smith Doorstop, who recently published his pamphlet, Woodsong, inspired by the madness of Sweeney. He claims to be an exiguous poet, to commit poems only infrequently. He's about to prove in September a tactful editor of the selected poems and satires of the American poet Edna St. Vincent Millay, a superb formal writer and one of the great sonneteers of her century or of any century. He's a more than accomplished formal writer himself. As it were, a tennis player who not only insists that the net be strung tight, but from poem to poem and from set to set adjusts it up and down, so his art is never predictable and is always finding new tones, new delights. His poetic godfather, as you know, we've assigned a godparent to each of our new poets, a poet from previous New Poetry's anthologies. His poetic godfather is Andrew Wynne Owen, another poet with 3 names, 2 syllables, 1 syllable, 2 syllables, so there's a pleasant symmetry. It made them inevitable companions in this journey. Andrew is also a consummate formalist, so they seem to be matched in that respect. And he came to bless this brilliant, rather alarming baby at the font. He writes, these excellent, humane, and humorous poems cover a range of emotional situations. The thoughtful tenderness of health, water falling everywhere fittingly reminiscent in a piece about the mind's vulnerabilities of Coleridge's Tragic Mariner. The likable self-satire of Fane, with deft knack for juggling idioms. A faint suspicion will drag its heels towards a dim awareness. And the tentative inquiring surrealism of the oneiroscopist, leaning on the picture frame I slipped into its silent world. Aside from having a sharp eye for human behavior, Fane Saunders, according to Andrew Wynne Owen, also seems to intuit some of the kinds of things that poets with some philosophical interests tend to orbit at some point. Ideas brilliantly explored in, for example, the work of recent Nobel laureate Louise Gluck, another Carcanet poet, of course, that all is one, that time and space are in some sense illusory, that the fundamental reality is mind-like, that the self is either real or somehow unreal, that free will is either epistemically basic or a subject for vast skepticism. I hope he continues to journey in this vein. As he writes, the diving helmet is a perfect fit. Andrew wishes his godchild to become prolific. And for my part, I very much hope that he will soon arrive at a first full collection and that Carcanet may have the freedom to consider it. None of these poems he writes, are the kind of thing I would ever choose to write. Some of them are the kind of thing I like to read. When he sent his poems to PN Review, I discovered that phrases stayed with me all afternoon. These poems are memorable speech and memorable thought, and they are speech and thought memorable because discovered in the language chosen and due to the forms devised and deployed by the poet. There are common themes and common tones between the poems, and they work together, but they don't foreground the poet. They foreground the poetry. They foreground the form, poem by poem. He tells us 6 lies about poetry in his headnote, and the 6th and most telling lie is this: your words are never entirely your own, nor mine. Believing this means I never feel lonely. So Tristram, over to you.
Well, I'd like to thank Michael Schmidt and Andrew Wynne-Owen for their lovely introductions to my poetry. And I just want to say how grateful I am to be part of this anthology and part of this reading tonight with these wonderful poets. The first poem I'd like to read you is called Health. And it was, I feel I should mention, given that title has taken on some sort of a different tone over the last year or so. This was written at the tail end of 2019 when I was staying in a little wooden cabin opposite the botanical gardens in Ventnor on the south coast of Isle of Wight. This is Health. What is that? Something honey-like that makes me lean in closer. A tag in Latin dangling from its neck below the bloom. Every flower has a stamen. Do I mean a stigma at its heart, to lure the needle-bearing honeybee, doing its rounds from bed to bed, fretting like a doctor, looping its indecipherable cursive in the air. The poster campaign tells us we must work to fight the stigma over mental health, but they don't mean that. Health, I mean. Nobody is angry or ashamed of being healthy. The rich sea air, my guidebook says, and rising temperatures mean semi-hardy plants that elsewhere just can't hack the weather, survive the whole year round outside here, kept alive by Ventnor. All my friends are sick. I love them and I'm scared. Zed is sick. I mean, she's ill, an ill wind, boding ill. The body bodes the way a broken bone can sense the storm, her every joint an advert for the coming inner weather. I want to help, but I just play with words, seeking shelter from the rain that all at once is everywhere and on me. I turn a corner past the greenhouse, find the blue pagoda. In it, you are reading this. Hello. Can I sit down? This is the closest I will ever come to being honest. Look at the pretty flowers. People died where we are sitting. Everyone my age is sick. I've never slept beside someone who didn't need pills to separate the day from night. Some of them have disappeared. Some wear the stigmata on the lower inner arm that marks the almost martyr. Variegated reads the metal tag, perennial. The sky is bleeding white, squeezed dry above the blue pagoda, but the rain keeps coming. That was the other thing. It's why they made the garden here after they knocked the old place down. In a room beside the mushroom house, a TV set repeats 3 minutes of a video from 1969. The BBC had sent a helicopter like a humming bee to hover near the empty sanatorium, not yet collapsed. A tracking shot. There's just so much of it. Window after window and an unseen voice explaining how the lungs would fill with what was held in drops of water. I'd like to bring them here, my friends. Tell them everything they lie in bed and think of doesn't matter for a while, that it can wait until they've got their breath back in this shelter we have made from words. The guidebook mentions that the doctor who founded Ventnor's Institute for Sickness of the Chest died here, tuberculosis. Yes, despite the warm sea air and honey in hot water. Is it me, or is it getting darker? Now it's late and I can hardly see the flowers. Close your eyes and sit with me for just a little longer. We'll talk about our friends, about the flower and its stigma till this rain dies down. The guidebook says he tried, the doctor. The guidebook says so many things, but we can't hear it over the water falling everywhere and on the blue pagoda. The next poem I'd like to read for you. After Andrew went on making this lovely comment about the humor in the poems, I think I've chosen the three least funny. But so the next slightly serious one is called Monkfish. It'd always be late. High on Red Bull and Blue Planet, Attenborough leveling her mind, she'd call up again, still up at 4 in the morning, not tearful, just earnest and wired, calling for no reason, no better reason than to share her latest newly memorized litany of names. Lophius or Monkfish or Fishing Frog or Sea Devil, revision. Of course she was fine. One time, she told me that she empathized with its teeth. The teeth will become temporarily depressed so as to offer no impediment to an object gliding towards the gut. God knows why I'd pick up. Pity or pride in my own selfless patience. She, the seashell, held to my ear, I'd listen, then half listen, like the line I pictured in the air between us. Neutral, intermittent, static, cagey about being, but reluctantly talked into it. The body, given time and a stable bed, will change and blend with its surroundings. Given time, I thought she'd learn to fit in, tone down the strangeness, or even occasionally sleep, to call someone else, anyone, Samaritans, Nightline, the talking clock, standard network rate. Your call is a low, keening sound. Your call is inaudible to divers. Your call is inaudible to all the undrowned. The last poem I'd like to read for you tonight is a love poem. And it's about a glass harmonica, which, as you probably know, is a kind of musical instrument, which is a series of glasses, empty glasses of different sizes in a wooden case, which you can, by wetting a finger and rubbing the rim, play different notes on. And this is partly a poem about that. The key. A glass harmonica is not a real harmonica and only half glass, full of nothing to the wetted brim, each chime the gift of half a drop of water, which in this weird aria is for a moment thicker than blood. Lammermoor, this stammered l'amour, is not the melody I used to sing. Lucia, for years I was running the taps till everything ran clear and cold, running a finger around the rim of every line, listening for the right ring. The tune I played was crystalline, controlled. It was a lifeless thing. The living key is the one you sing, the note that's true. Benjamin Franklin, 9 years before inventing the glass harmonica, unearthed it too. It calls for risk, a little luck, a blinding light. It is the iron and the tether and the thing in flight above. The right key, reader, is that word you're thinking of, and it will let you play with lightning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tristram. That last one, for some reason, put me in mind of Marianne Moore. I think it may be the length of the line and possibly the way you delivered it. Our last poet this evening is Isabelle Williams. And when Isabelle Williams sent her Catullus to Carcanet, I was not prepared for what I was going to read, I have to say. PN Review had published poems by her 21 years ago under another name. 3 of the poems were 13-liners, almost sonnets, but stopping short and deploying 3 rather than 4 rhymes. They were teasingly complete in completions. What you may ask is a translator doing in a book of new poetries, especially a translator of Catullus, on whom almost everyone has sharpened or blunted his, and it less often her, poetic teeth. How is it that translations can be original enough to be introduced into the company of original poems? Well, here original reclaims an older meaning, perhaps, attesting to origins, and the origins of these translations are not only in the 2,000-year-old Latin text, but in Japanese traditions as well. I had to find out what shibari is. I knew or thought I knew Catullus. This poet's boys and women and his varying passions and positions were not removing their togas, but bound in a different direction. The word nudus means naked and sounds very like nodum, not with a K in Latin. Isabel's godfather in New Poetries VIII is the wonderful poet, sleuth, and bookseller John Clegg. What makes Catullus appealing to translators, says John, is paradoxically what makes him impossible to translate. We identify with him and the situations he describes far more than any other Roman poet. But this identification is dependent on glossing over the differences between Roman sexual mores and our own. And those mores, when we come to them, are unfamiliar, unappealing, and in places unreconstructible. What he likes about these translations or these versions, these poems, is their oddness, their difference, their remoteness, the way Isabelle steers around the problem by means of the idiom of shibari, Japanese rope bondage. A permanent reminder, he says John, that the sexual practices and politics of Catullus's world are not my own. With the poems rendered into those terms, with that guarantee there, it feels as though a major blockage has been lifted. We can see more of the poet because we can see honestly the parts of him that we're out of sympathy with. We're less inclined to make him Tinder generation by proxy. He adds, the important thing is the restoration of exteriority, the refusal of coziness. Now that we finally have a Catullus sufficiently alien, we can get on with deciding what we think of his poetry. Now, what I really think is that this book by Isabelle is my favorite English Catullus, and that's because it is not quite English. Isabelle speaks about the struggle of the translator of such a poet. It is, she says, like cage fighting with 2 opponents in her case, not just a top poet, but the schoolgirl I was, trained to show the examiner that she knew what each word meant, and she had to get over that, schoolgirl. Given the conviction and courage of the translations of the works themselves, it has to be remembered that they started in a kind of fear and self-effacement. They had something to prove. It seems to me that they have proven it and been faithful to the originality of the originals in a compelling way. And lest we get carried away with erotic anticipation, Isabelle warns us that rope bondage people are dismissed as train spotters by the rest of the fetish community because of their nerdy devotion to knots. I've found a similar sense of acceptance and dedication around the tea urn at Kensington Gardeners Club. Well, I hand you over now to our guide through the world of Roman and Japanese bondage and poetry.
Thank you very much indeed. This is a cracking book, as everybody knows. And Michael, I sort of recognize myself almost, but I must say I was so impressed by what John Clegg wrote, expressing it far better than I could myself about the whole purpose of making Catullus alien. Anyway, let's start. Number 7. Stress testing are we, mistress? How many of your tropes in rope can be endured before the poet chokes? Ply me, hemp, silk, jute, and tie me. Ichinawa, takatekote, futomomo, hishikarada, tasuki, kannoki, hashira, daruma shibari, all of it. Seminawa for the burn. Count the stars that spy on sly lovers when the night is ball-gagged. That's how many of your tight knots and rope marks will deliver me beyond madness, more than a voyeur's torch could spot, or a jealous sensei take to pieces. And there's a picture of Red Lily tying Zlata, and a sensei is a Japanese teacher, Japanese word for a teacher. And now, oh joy, just a moment, I need to, that's better. Catullus 16, there isn't time to go into the history of Catullus 16. It is not about violent gay sexual assault, it is about poetry. There are some people who can't tell the difference, they need to get out more. What's been happening is that two of Catullus's poety friends have been castigating him for writing poems like the former one that I just read, which describes being kissed by his girlfriend. And these boys think it's a bit sissy because they're more into Ted Hughes, obviously, but this is Catullus's response, number 16. Beware the mighty sodomite face bandit. You two batty boys dishing out lit crit insist my kissy fit verse is Hello Kitty. Look, being the guardian of what's good is work for the poet, not for the poet's works. Liberation from your taste police gives my words a musky allure that can stir not just boys, but the prick memory of shaggy old ex-shaggers. So writing kiss poems is an unmanly feat. First line, repeat. So on to number 37, let's go clubbing. You boys queuing outside Berlin, Berlin, you think you're the only ones with cocks let in to fuck the girls while the rest of us get herded away. Have another think. The poet fantasizes about ejaculating in the reluctant faces of 200 male clubbers. He then considers his options. I'll squirt correctly spelt obscene graffiti all over your facade because the girl who broke away from my hold, loved with more love than other women will reap, the one I had such brutal fights to keep, is your house dominant. They all want her, the cream of the alphas and harder for me to bear, the bottom feeders, especially you, lord of the hairy arse, all the way from Saragossa's plague zone of randy, fluffy bunnies. Senor Ignatius, raised to foreign nobility by your clogged beard and glaring expat teeth, scrubbed with vintage Spanish urine. The poet puts down his tools and goes for a pee. And there's a picture here of two people in a workshop in Oxford. So the next poem, 38, I haven't normally given them titles, and Catullus doesn't have titles, but the title here, With a Murmur, My Ravings, is my translation of the only fragment that we have by Cornificius, to whom Catullus is speaking in this poem. With a murmur, my ravings. Can't go on but does, can't be born but must be down, and the weight bears down each day, each hour, Cornificius. Bad for your Catullus, but have you written the least, the tiniest scrap to calm me? Feel my rage, is this all your love means? Whisper me a consolation, please, sadder than houseman's trembling tears. And now we come to my last one, which is Catullus 51. This is translation of Sappho's fragment 31. And Sappho was as distant from Catullus in time as Shakespeare is from us. Catullus knew that this poem was unfinished in that we don't have the ending, it hasn't come down to us. So he wrote his own ending. But there's also a little bit missing from Catullus's poem here. There is a lacuna, so you'll see what I've done with that when we get there. And I inserted a line from A Midsummer Night's Dream. I found when I was working with Catullus that every now and then little fragments of Midsummer Night's Dream would just pop into my mind. It's a very bondagey sort of play, but we won't get into that now. So 51. I can't compete with the rock god superhero, God's begging him to take the shiniest halo, that man intent on you, ogling, provoking your sexy laughter. I'm muted, my nerves torn out with hooks, because when I see you, Claudia, I fumble for a line and find a lacuna. Mouth crammed with earth, limbs hot and clumsy with longing, high tide pounding my skull, trashed headlights and a windscreen crazed to opacity. Idling Catullus, it stalls your intention, and maidens call it love in idleness. Without a plan, you're restless and distracted, idle coasting, toppled kings and golden cities in legends. And now we've come to the end of my section. So there we are. Thank you very much. That's what it's all about. Ichinawa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isabel. And we should mention that your book, which is now out and is very beautiful, the whole book, which this is just a glimpse. In the back behind her, you can see the wonderful image, which is also the cover of the Carcanet catalogue this time. We'll be launching Isabel's book in about 2 weeks' time. Is that right? On a Wednesday.
24th. Yeah.
24th. Yes. Good. Thank you. Now, John, will you come back too now?
Hello.
In fact, can we all come back? Can we all join? Can we all come alive?
That would be great. Fantastic to hear the poems, Isabel, and Tristram as well. So thank you so much. I kind of asked a little bit beforehand about some possible things I might talk to you about, but it struck me that you're all working with forms in different ways. And I wondered if I might ask you a little bit about that, Holly, with sonnets and stanzas, and Christine with refrains and regular stanzas, and Tristram with those lovely jigsaw shapes, and then Isabel, I think, probably with the original as a form that you're working with as well. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you think about form in your poems. Tristram, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay.
Sure. I find, for me, a lot of the time I'm kind of led by rhythm. I find having some kind of pattern of rhythm in a poem is a way of getting the poem written. It's like I'm trying to fill something with water, and I need something to put the water into. But I also, I'm sorry if I'm just stuttering all over the place, but this is something I care really strongly about, but I'm very much in two minds about. I love poems where rhythm is an overt part of the poem, whether that's in a traditional form or it's experimenting with it in new ways. And I also love the kind of fastidiousness of someone like Marianne Moore, where she says the first line of every stanza will have 1 syllable. The second line of every stanza will have 17 syllables. But I also distrust the Marianne Moore approach slightly. I feel a poem where the formal constraints are too tidy is a little bit like the kid in class who's the teacher's pet, who's got the too perfect side parting. I often start writing a poem with some kind of elaborately convoluted formal constraints in place, and then deliberately mess them up slightly in the editing stage. I want it to feel organic. But for me, it's more a way of getting the poem written in the first place than something I'd like to get a sticker for once the poem is finished.
It's very striking. You can see the poems too, though. It really is.
Well, if you do set yourself a formal challenge, I mean, as Marianne Moore does, it's amazing when she carries it through. I think I see what you're saying about a form being enabling, but to then betray the form seems a little bit naughty, really. It's slightly possibly shibari. It's kind of, you tie the knot and then it doesn't matter. I don't, Isabel, once you've, as it were, chosen the formal principle, you might hurt the person if you violated the form chosen. What do you think?
Really don't know, because I don't actually do it, Michael. You know, this is just for sort of decoration only. I don't even draw the knots. So I think you're maybe ahead of me in the whole sort of technical side. I mean, what I would say about formality, yes, I've been handed, you know, from the Latin, this great sort of trough, and Wallace was so versatile. He could use practically every form and invent some of his own. But I'm not one of those people who is slavishly trying to copy Latin meter, because I really think you need to get a life if you're going to do that kind of thing. I mean, yes, have a go at Galliambics if you must. Tennyson did it absolutely brilliantly. I'm not even going to go there. Just occasionally, you know, I'm very fond of pentameters. Yes, they're with us, embedded in English for a reason. They sound great in English. Latin meters generally don't sound that good in English. I notice you've got someone here. Can you please tell me how to pronounce how C-O-A-S-E? How does
Halcoes, Coes. Is that right?
Yeah.
Halcoes, because you've got sort of don't know if you can hear, kind of sapphic meter going on here in Escaped, and that there are sort of echoes of it in what other people are doing. You notice little fragments sometimes of really ancient rhythms.
I wasn't thinking of derivative forms. I was thinking more of the form that the poem demands, and the form that the poem demands, rather than a form that you're drawing from the Latin. Because I think that would be pedantic. I agree. And
yeah.
But anyway.
Christine, how do you feel about when you're trying to get those refrains going, or getting those big stanzas that you use so well in your poems, and those repetitions?
I think when I'm thinking of writing a poem, I tend not to think of form, but then I find myself wanting to work more with form. But I tend to do what I felt comes naturally, which is to write in stanzas. And I tend to use refrains when I'm trying to surprise the reader, to sort of to give them a word that they wouldn't expect, you know, that was coming. So yeah, that's what I tend to do. But I definitely felt, whilst I was thinking about the new sort of collection I'm hoping to start writing, that I would like to write more in forms. You know, I'm thinking maybe I could try a sonnet or something like that. But I tend to stay away from them just because I felt like they're more restricting. They've asked a lot more than when you're working in free verse.
And Holly, speaking of sonnets, can you talk a little bit about how you use form in the poems?
I think my answer probably chimes a bit with Chris's. I mean, I talk about writing a poem because if you say you compose poems, you risk sounding a little pretentious. But often I'm hearing the music in my head, and then when that's almost fixed, then it gets written down. And it's often not until we've gone a little further along, it's on the paper, that I say, oh yes, we're heading in that direction. Well, okay, let's help grow it to where it's clearly leaning towards, and in that way we might get something more formal. I'm getting a lot of microphone feedback. Are you getting it? I'm not sure what's causing that. Is that better?
Yes, that's much better.
Please tell me that didn't happen all the way through my reading.
Oh.
I guess that's great, thank you all. One of the other questions that we were going to ask you is a little bit how you have found this online and Zoom context for poetry. So I might just run that around with you before we finish up. And what has the year been like for you, beginning to get the poems out, or have you been getting along to events, and how do you find it? Holly, will you start us off now that you've got the mic sorted?
Well, I think there's kind of two things going on there, because I think on the one side it feels like there's this amazing wealth of things that are going on. Particularly, I'm thinking of festivals where normally if you go to poetry festivals, you might, you know, carefully pick which ones you will attend, and now suddenly you could zoom into any of them. But a lot of events start between 7 and 8, and I have a toddler, and he doesn't understand I'm going to another room, I've shut the door, and I'm going to a poetry event. So, you know, as I was reading earlier, he was bashing on the door saying, "Mummy, mummy," while my partner was trying to distract him because he doesn't know what's going on. So it's funny because a lot of the events I've gone to, but I haven't been there live. It's the ones that advertisers, you can pay your fee and then catch up with this and we'll send you the link. So like lots of these Carcanet events, I've seen them all, but I haven't been there in the chat in the moment. So you feel like you're missing it a bit. And it also means you don't have that other space. You know, if you go out to an event, you get to have another persona. You get to be the person who is thinking about poetry and who is talking to other adults and has put aside that little section in your head that even if you're not the person who is specifically looking after the child at that moment, is always in the background waiting for the crash as he does something to accidentally damage himself. But I think that the real interesting thing will be what happens next when lockdown eases and we have a return to live events, how we manage to keep the online events going along with the live events in a way that doesn't exclude anyone and manages to make both audiences feel included. And I'm quite interested to see where that goes, because he won't always be little, and I'm looking forward to being able to see events that I wouldn't otherwise go to.
Hasn't this been an opportunity, though, for the audience to return to being readers? I mean, we've always insisted on putting the text on the screen because what we are as book publishers, and we're text publishers, and I hate it when the Arts Council always refers to how do you address your audience? Well, we don't, we address readers. And it seems to me with the text there, with the poet there slightly reduced in size and importance, the poem somehow comes out at you. At least I hope it does. Tristram, how do you feel about this phenomenon?
Well, I'd agree with you about being able to read along on the screen. I think it's incredibly useful. Sometimes I find at a reading, if it's a poem that I'm not familiar with, just wishing I could press rewind on real life and get the poet to go back and do the last 4 lines again, either because I particularly enjoyed them or was slightly flummoxed by them. Yeah, I agree with Holly about the need to find a way to continue the kind of good work of making these events open to a wider audience, but also finding a way to make that not at the expense of the live festival itself. That if you've got a literary festival in a tiny village somewhere that normally draws reliably big crowds, I don't know to what extent having all of the events online might lead people to think, oh, I can stay at home and watch it on my laptop instead. I'd hope that people would still want to turn up for the live experience.
We hope so too, Tristram, don't we? Isabelle, I know you're planning an online exhibition along with the book, am I right, as well?
In as far as the parameters of Carcanet's online setup will allow, I think yes is the answer. So I had a spasm of stress then because I've actually got to get on with it. But I think what's remarkable is the way that Carcanet and other outfits, and I'm including the concert hall, the Wigmore Hall in this, have been forced to reinvent themselves from a standing start without having dedicated IT personnel. And I keep echoing that thought. Yes, please let's have this continuing strand somehow. I mean, if you're watching a concert on the Wigmore Hall, what's so interesting is the number of people writing in Russian on the sort of chat panel, and they're not all in Marylebone. You know, they must be very far flung, so they're getting fantastic new opportunities. And just slightly to dodge to the side of the question, in here there's the most COVID line of poetry, or 2 lines that I've ever seen, by Chad Campbell, from his poem Stones and Sweeper. You will come to us, October and October, October and October and October. And you could substitute any month, and it's not quite his original meaning because he was thinking of a sort of annual thing. Maybe we'll have this kind of annual COVID thing. I don't know, but to me that kind of sums up COVID in just the most beautiful and succinct way.
That's great. And Christine, I might finish by asking you about this question. I say this as somebody who was looking at the Carcanet YouTube channel the other day, and I saw that one of your videos of one of your readings has now got 2,000 or 3,000 viewers over the last. This is one of these odd things that has happened, isn't it?
Yes, I guess it's I'm putting the video on Facebook. I think a lot of people are sort of follows me on there. They sort of they get to view the video on there as well. Going back to the Zoom thing, I think for me, it's much easier to invite people to, for example, to tonight, you know, to sort of to see me read, because it's not, they don't have to travel anywhere. But I feel also that the downside of it is not being able to take questions from the audience so that they could actually ask you things about the poem that they really enjoy and that they would like to know more about.
Yeah, well, we have tonight, thank you, Christine, thank you, Tristram, thank you, Holly and Isabel, and thank you to everybody who's written in the chat so nicely and responsively to all the poems as well, and about how much they're enjoying the live events online as part of this year, which has been a relief. Next Thursday night, we're going to have the last of our new poetries launches on Zoom, and we are going to be hearing from Stav Poleg, Benjamin Nehammer, Chad Campbell, who Isabel just mentioned, Mariam Hessavi, and Nell Prince. So maybe we'll see some of you back next Thursday night, and it'll be the last of our Zoom ones for this book. But thanks again for coming. Michael, do you want to?
Yeah, we may overrun just a tiny bit, like 3 minutes next week, because I was thinking people might like to hear you and me talking a little bit about the effort of joint editing, because it was very enabling and very exciting, because we respected each other, and that doesn't always happen when we're editing with somebody else.
It's been an absolute pleasure working with these poems, hasn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
All right.
So
good night, everybody.
good night.